Welcome to the 2024 Upstream and Community Capacity Building Fund information session. In this section, we will share some background about the fund, as well as the application and decision-making processes for the Upstream and Community Capacity Building Fund. Before we get started, I want to share a little bit about the background. This is important to understand why we are so connected with the Community Safety Wellbeing Plan and the origins of this fund and the approach that we use to allocate these funds. And so really it started in 2021 with engagement and research for the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. The Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan was a plan that all municipalities developed and really gave insight into the needs of community to feel safe, to feel like they could thrive and reach their full potential in the community. And this process was a little bit different in Waterloo Region from some other municipalities. We took a very community-led, community-based approach. We had conversations, many conversations with community members, and in those conversations, we heard what was most important and what some of the common barriers were to being able to achieve full potential and to be able to thrive in Waterloo Region. And so some of those things that we heard were that the work happening community, the grassroots and preventative work that was happening is underfunded. And so many organizations were under-resourced and doing the much needed work in community on a volunteer basis and off the side of death. And that was really something that was really important in those conversations that we heard was to make sure that community members and grassroots groups were adequately resourced and supported through government agencies. And so that Community Safety Wellbeing Plan really became the foundation for the work that we all began to do as a community to make changes and to move forward as a community. And so that plan was approved in January 2022. And at the same time, Council was having conversations about upstream work and what was really needed to prevent harm and to, in order to redistribute power to community and to be able to respond to community needs. And so there was a fund that was allocated by Council called the Upstream Fund. And so they tasked staff with coming up with a process and approach for allocating those funds out to community. And so building off what we heard in the Community Safety and Wellbeing Planning process, we knew many of the priorities of community, many of the needs of community, but we also had conversations with community about what that funding process could look like, what that approach could be, and had really great insight from community about the need for a funding process that really centered the priorities of the Community Safety Wellbeing Plan, that was community-led, that really gave an opportunity for accountability. And so those are all principles and concepts that were foundational in the way that we developed the upstream approach. And I'll talk a little bit more about the upstream approach itself shortly. But there were a number of other things happening at the same time. And another piece of the puzzle was that the Council had also allocated funds through what is called the Equity Fund. And that fund was really focused on making sure that we were able to provide funding to organizations in the community that are led by and serving our First Nations, Inuit, Métis, African, Caribbean, Black, as well as racialized groups. And that's really recognizing that these equity deserving groups have historically and continue to be to experience barriers to accessing the resources and supports that they need to do the work happening in community. And so that fund was also implemented by Council. And so when we came up with when staff came up with the upstream process and this approach that's really grounded in community need, community voice, the decision was made to allocate both funds and to really make the most of this approach that we had implemented, or we were going to be implementing in the spring of 2022. And so that was kind of the start of pairing these two funds together. And in the fall of 2022 was when we had the first launch of the upstream funding. And so we accepted applications and distributed those funds in 2022, and then also did the same thing in spring of 2023, again, co-allocating the upstream as well as community capacity building funds. While that was happening, we were also doing work to, again, action the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan, and a symposium was hosted in the summer of 2023 to, again, have those conversations with community and continue to hear what was most important to action out of the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. And so we heard 4 areas for action, priorities for action from community. Again, I'll speak about those in a little bit more detail, but that really brings us to this third cycle of the Upstream Fund, which is where we are now. And so I hope that that gives a little bit of context and hopefully gives you a little bit of a background as to why we really talk about the Community Safety Wellbeing Plan, the priorities, so much when we talk about these funds is because that plan was really the foundations for the funding approach. And really, we continue to honor some of the things that we heard in the development of that plan in the way that we allocate these funds. As I mentioned, we have developed a 3-step process with community that really gives the opportunity to allocate these funds in a way that community is an integral part of every step of the process. And so the open call and engagement piece of the step of the process really provides an opportunity for us to go out and share information about this funding opportunity, gives an opportunity for community to come and learn and to connect with one another, and also, we hope, fosters an environment of collaboration. One of the core principles that we really hope to implement through upstream and community capacity building funding is around collaboration rather than competition. And through these collaborative events during the open call and engagement stage, we create spaces for community to come together, to meet with one another, to hear what's happening in community, and hopefully create an environment where collaboration can develop and can grow and thrive. The next step is decision making. And so this step is, again, very community-led, and really it is very different from the way that we have done funding in the past, in that community has the power to make those decisions. And again, as we talk about the links back to Community Safety Wellbeing Plan, one of the biggest needs was around redistributing power to community. And so we're really trying to do that with this fund and in this step in particular, as we have a group of community members who are representative of the diversity in our community. They come together to review the applications, to make funding decisions, and at the end of the day, they are the ones who are really have the power to make change in their community through these decisions. And then finally, when we talk about sharing stories of impact and learning, another way that we're trying to do this differently is by being really collaborative in the way that we share the stories from upstream. We are working with the funded organizations to really look at what's most important to you to share back to community. And we've built some of the reporting based on that. We also recognize that this is a new process and there's lots to learn. And so we ourselves, through the upstream team, are always looking at ways that we can assess and evaluate and improve the process with each step of the way. So when we say upstream, it is quite a large term, but what we mean by upstream is really about preventing harm before it happens. When we talk about upstream in a very academic sense or a macro sense, we talk about system change, redistributing power, wealth, decision-making. All of those pieces are critical elements of upstream. But when we talk about the way that we do it with the Upstream Fund, it's really looking at how grassroots organizations have the ability to have upstream change, which is really looking at the ways that grassroots groups, organizations are positioned to prevent harm by providing support ahead of time before individuals are in a crisis situation. And then in some sense, there are elements of crisis intervention. And we understand that crisis intervention is an important part of upstream work, as we see that intervening in a crisis situation can stop cycles that then provide an opportunity to prevent continued or long-term harm and pulling individuals and families out of cycles of generational trauma. And so I think I've talked about this a little bit, but really at its core, the Upstream Fund is focused on initiatives that decrease barriers and improve systems to support people to achieve their full potential. And then we have the Community Capacity Building Fund, which is really looking at doing similar things, but it's really a fund that's directed at funding organizations that are led by and serving First Nations, Inuit Métis, African, Caribbean, Black, as well as racialized communities. And so again, they're both really looking at upstream interventions. The key difference is that Community Capacity Building Fund is specifically for groups that are led by and serving those specific populations. Okay, so we're going to move into talking a little bit more about the specifics of this funding cycle. And so key dates for you to remember: we have opened applications March 11th, and we'll run applications, or we'll accept applications until April 28th. Throughout that period, you'll be able to connect with the Upstream team through collaborative sessions, or if you would like to connect with the team at a virtual drop-in session. So if you have a specific quick question that you want to ask, we host weekly drop-in sessions on Wednesday mornings at 11 o'clock, and you can just access the Zoom link via the Upstream website. Just drop in, ask any questions that you may have, and we'd be happy to answer them. Alternatively, if you would like to book a time with us, if you have a little bit more of a complex or detailed question, by emailing upstream@regionofwaterloo.ca, which you will see on the screen, you'll be able to schedule a time to connect with us, and we can answer any questions that you may have about the application process. A few details about the application process. So I've spoken about two different funds. The key thing to keep in mind is that you do not need to do two separate applications for the funds. Basically, there's one application that will give you access to both of the funds. And so Upstream, we are allocating just under $2 million this year, and Community Capacity Building, we will be allocating $1 million. So regardless of which fund you're eligible for, you complete the exact same application, and then through the decision-making process, the group will look at what you are proposing and make the allocation based on the pot of funds that your proposal most aligns with. Another key thing to keep in mind when you're preparing a proposal is that you can request for up to 2 years. So you can either submit a 1-year application, or you can, if you want something a little bit more long-term, slightly more long-term, you can prepare a proposal for a 2-year consideration. You also, when you're thinking about budgeting and planning out your proposal, another thing to keep in mind is that we really encourage groups to think about what they need to implement the program or the initiative that is being proposed, and to request those funds. There is no maximum amount and there is no minimum amount for Upstream funding. As far as eligibility for the funds, this is quite consistent with what we have done in previous years. This has not changed. And so key pieces of eligibility that apply to both funds you will find in the blue column. So things like operating in Waterloo Region must be not-for-profit. So there can't be any sort of revenue generating activities or elements of the program or proposal. One other piece there is that your group does not need to be incorporated. So it can be an unincorporated group that is, or an individual applying for Upstream funds. You should just work with a financial sponsor, and we highly recommend that if that is what you're going to be doing, you just reach out to the Upstream team and we can kind of talk through some of the recommendations and pieces around what that looks like. When it comes to the criteria for the two funds, this is where you see the biggest difference between the two, and I've already spoken about it a little bit. Really, the biggest difference is that criteria for the Community Capacity Building Fund indicates that initiatives must be led by and serving First Nations, Inuit Métis, African, Caribbean, Black, or racialized populations. Outside of that, both funds are really prioritizing initiatives that serve equity-deserving groups that align with community safety well-being plan priorities, and that are really demonstrate alignment with some of the other priorities that we have outlined in the terms of references for both of those funds. Another piece that we want to point out is that each year we kind of do an assessment and understand what are the areas that are most important for our funding priorities. And so for 2024, we're really looking at collaboration between organizations. We'd really, again, as with previous years, like to focus on providing funding to new initiatives that have not previously been funded, and we're looking at prioritizing geographic distribution of the funds across Waterloo Region. As this is our third year of funding, we recognize that there may be groups who have received upstream funds in the past, and so this slide really is just to indicate some of the decision-making processes and some of the eligibility criteria for those organizations. The main piece here is that new initiatives are prioritized for Upstream and Community Capacity Building Funds. That being said, if you are a previous recipient, you are still eligible to apply, just depending on where you are in your financial reporting, as well as your project reporting, and where you are in spending out funds that you have received in the past. And so if you are in that situation, we highly recommend, again, that you reach out to the Upstream team so that we could talk through the specifics of your situation to understand whether or not this cycle is the best cycle for you to apply for, or if there might be some planning for future cycles based on where you are in your spending and your project progression. When it comes to submitting your applications, we have tried our best to make sure that this is a simple and barrier-free process. We have a number of ways that you can submit your application for funding, either online. You can fill out your form directly online. If you do not complete your submission in one sitting, that's fine. It will save your information and you can come back and complete that at a later time. And so you can access that from our website or through the QR code that's on the screen. If you really would like or would benefit from some support from our team to just kind of put words to your ideas, we can absolutely support you with transcribing your proposal and just documenting that into the form for the decision-making committee to review. And then another option, if you wanted to do something, a virtual or a video or a audio submission, that's also completely acceptable. And so if you wanted to respond to some of the questions respond to the questions in the application verbally, you can absolutely do that. And so just reach out to the team again, and we can make sure that we get that submission to the decision-making committee, but that is another way that you can provide your information for consideration. The final pieces that I want to talk about are decision-making. As you're putting together your proposal, it will be really important to tie what you're doing to the fund priorities and the objectives that are outlined in the Upstream Fund and the Community Capacity Building Fund terms of reference. And so, and we've mentioned a few times, I've mentioned a few times, the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. And this is a very high-level overview of what is contained in that plan. If you have not already, I would recommend that you either review the application guide, or actually there is a lot of information online about the Community Safety Wellbeing Plan that you can find through the Upstream Fund website. But overall, the Community Safety Wellbeing Plan outlines some of the key things that we heard in those conversations back in 2021 from communities. Some of the things that we heard were around the need for self-determined communities, for communities to be able to have the autonomy to say what they need and how best to meet those needs. Another piece that we heard was around system accountability and action. And so partially through this fund, we hope we are responding to that, but also looking at other ways that we can build in accountability and action to community. Circles of support is something else that we heard was a large need from community, and that was, how do we support the groups and organizations and kind of informal supports that are available in community to support individuals and to provide some of the needs that they have. Other priorities or other needs that we heard were things around just basic needs. So the social determinants of health, around healthcare, around education, around justice, truth and reconciliation. So opportunities to build on, to build education and to build action around truth and reconciliation in our community. Anti-hate, racism, and oppression was another of the categories or themes that we heard in those conversations. And so as best as possible as you're preparing applications, you want to be able to identify how what you're doing speaks to some of these priorities that have been outlined in the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. Earlier, I also mentioned that we had continued conversation with community, and in 2023, we met again to talk about what are the most pressing needs within the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan that we really need to focus our resources and efforts on in the coming years. And so I'm sure this list is likely not a surprise to many of you, but we heard that addressing mental health needs, combating hate, creating safe spaces, as well as addressing intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, etc., were some of the things that we really needed to focus our resources on for action in 2024. And so we continue to support the Community Safety Wellbeing Plan priorities through our funding by prioritizing these for funding in 2024. Again, I mentioned a little bit of information about the Community Change Committee already, but I'll reiterate that that is a community, a group of community members. These are peers in the community who have, some have been part of the process in previous years and have brought their learnings forward. And then we also have new members each year who are bringing fresh insights and ideas to the process. And so this group reviews all of the applications. They are led by a community facilitator who supports them in kind of that review, that conversation process to decide what should be funded. And really that is based on what most closely aligns with the Upstream Fund priorities, the Community Capacity Building Fund priorities, and the CSWP priorities as well. To give you a little bit of guidance as far as what the group will be looking at, there are a number of items listed on the screen. So things like whether or not the project activities are clearly identified, whether or not there is strong alignment with the fund priorities, the organization commitment to reconciliation and equity, whether or not the budget reasonably reflects the project activities is another piece. And so another piece for you to consider as you're completing your proposal is some of these decision-making assessment areas. And then hopefully that will guide you and help you to understand how to focus your energy as you're putting together a proposal. And then finally, for applicants who have previously received upstream funds, we ask a little bit of information about what's the impact that you have seen previously with the funds that have been received, and how will additional funds help you to better or increase the ability to meet the needs of community. And finally, we just wanted to share with you a little bit about previous recipients. I know that sometimes when we talk about upstream, it sounds very large, very ambitious for grassroots groups to kind of make some of the system change that we think about when we think about upstream. But we really want to reiterate and reinforce the importance of the work happening at the grassroots level and the importance of the preventative and the kind of the immediate crisis intervention work that is happening in the community, the education work that's happening, the work around building around arts and the opportunity that has to build a sense of community and belonging. And so we have a number of recipients over the course of the last 2 years. We have funded 74 initiatives or 74 organizations to do upstream work, and would encourage you to visit the website to see a list of all of the applicants, what they have done. And we also have a short video there that provides information about some of the work that's already happening in the community. And we hope that you find that helpful as you are thinking through and putting together your proposals. That brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope that this has been helpful. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have additional questions, if you have thoughts that you would like to discuss with the Upstream team, we are always available. Please email upstream@regionofwaterloo.ca. Or you can visit us, just drop in at one of our drop-in sessions to to connect with us, and we would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much.